Beyond Science, Conversations with Arthur M. Young. Interviewer Charles Fauvre discusses issues of science and consciousness with Arthur Young, honored inventor of the Bell helicopter, philosopher, and author of The Reflexive Universe. Today, the four elements, modern light on an ancient cosmology.
Hello, Arthur. When I first studied chemistry, I was taught that the four elements, fire, water, earth, air, were sort of a simplistic notion of how the universe was made or things were put together. And I wonder if you'd have something to say to us about that.
Well, I remember thinking that too. I mean, it was just an old-fashioned, stupid superstition.
Superstition, yeah.
Then I moved a step maybe in recognizing there are actually four states of matter. The solid, the liquid, the vapor state, which would correspond to air, and the fire state would correspond to an ionized gas. The difference between a normal vapor and an ionized gas is that the ionized gas is much rarer. The particles don't touch each other, whereas in air, they're batting each other all the time. Mm-hmm. At any rate, this is worth taking seriously, but it's not the ancient notion of the four elements. It's only a step toward. I didn't become aware of this until I ran into it with astrology.
Of course.
And of course, in astrology, the four elements is very basic. And when I began to take astrology seriously, I began to think more with it and to realize that these four elements were a very important, you might say, four different categories of meaning. We use the term air to make known. Put it on the air, or air your opinions. Mm-hmm. We use the term water, liquid assets, in talking about financing. A liquid asset is one that's easily converted to something else. Mm-hmm. So water comes to represent change as against thought. Mm-hmm. Then earth, to earth something is to make it practical, to get down to solid objects, brass tacks.
To ground it.
Ground it. They're all earth references. And fire is, of course, a kind of spiritual thing, and it has various, if you say fire as a verb, it means to throw a person out of the company, fire him from the company. But the general idea of throwing out is mm-hmm. typical of fire, the rays of the sun going out. Mm-hmm. Radiance, being, that's fire.
All fired up.
All fired up, fired with enthusiasm.
Fired, yes.
Catch fire, or ignite, and also starting. You start the car by turning on the ignition, you see.
Ignite, I like that.
Right. But fire has that initiating, starting principle.
Yes. The sun, the creator.
Right. Well, also there is an angular relation, and this is brought out by astrology because the four elements are like the four directions of space. I suppose you could go back and talk about Greek times, but the Greeks did not understand the elements. This might seem a surprise.
Yes, it does.
You get Greek philosophers saying, well, some of them thought that it was all fire, and others thought it was all air. I don't know whether all elements were represented, but there were a number number that said it was one element rather than others. But that's not the proper use of the elements, because it's like trying to say a square has only one side. The point of the elements is to bring out the four aspects necessary to describe things. That's why I say there's like four categories.
So, Arthur, you're not saying that it's the physical universe that's composed of these four elements, are you? I mean, what universe is it?
Well, it provides a very elegant way of describing the total universe, which includes the physical. Maybe I'm jumping ahead, but you could call the spiritual universe the fire, and the earth the physical universe. But they actually interrelate. For instance, the water is physical, but it's not objective. It's like emotions and feelings and forces. The air is a very interesting one in that connection, because it is the theory that the physicist uses, which is not the same as the physical facts. See, if I say, if I hit this thing, ouch, but then I say that was a chair. But when I talk about chairs, I'm in a conceptual realm. And as, what was his name, Khrushchevsky, who started this whole idea of semantics, he would say, you mustn't say that that's a chair, because as soon as you say it's a chair, you impose the mental concept on the object. Anyhow, four elements are the four possible ways of looking at the total universe. Only one is the physical universe of the scientists of particular facts.
Yes.
Others are the theoretical universe, the emotional universe, and the spiritual universe.
That's only four elements, though. Why do we limit it to just four elements?
Oh, why not have five?
Why not have 25?
Well, I think that's where the really interesting thing emerges, that you think, well, 5 elements would be better than 4. But when you shift to 5, you change the whole ball game. You're no longer dealing with analysis into aspects. You're introducing another factor, and that's a very interesting one, five possibilities, but it's not what is meant by the fourness of the 4 elements. In a sense, you could drop the term element and just talk about the fourness of the universe.
All right.
So, and if you were to talk about fiveness, that would be a different subject, or threeness.
I see.
If you're talking about threeness, you're talking about motion and change, because it always takes 3 terms to describe motion, one state and another state and something in between. There has to be a connection between the two, because if it was just one and then the other, you wouldn't know. Unless there's a carryover from the one to the other, you wouldn't know you would have changed.
So maybe the idea of the concept of 4 itself is even more important than the individual elements,
Right. The individual elements help color in, fill in the detail, but the fourness gives the theoretical structure to the thing you're talking about, which is strictly analysis.
It's strictly analysis.
Yes. In other words, you're dividing the whole into its aspects.
All right.
I suppose I talk about, say, a machine, any machine.
All right.
There's the hardware, the pieces that go together.
Mm-hmm.
There's the blueprint that enabled you to make the machine. And there's the motive power of the machine, because the machine has to have something to move it. And there's the purpose of the machine. You can't ignore the purpose.
Yes. And I can see then we have two axes here.
Well, the two axes help, it makes it rigorous.
Makes it rigorous.
In the sense, the mathematician is fond of the notion of independence. They use the notion of independence. And what that means is that you're measuring things and you're interested in the measures that are independent of one another. For instance, you can walk north without walking east. But when you get 4, you get an interesting combination. While you can walk north without walking east, you can't walk north without counteracting south. So north and south have a different kind of difference from north and east.
Yes.
East-west, you could say, cuts across the north-south, obviously in a geometrical sense, but also in an intellectual sense that that axis is independent of this axis. But north is not independent of south, because if you go north, you're going the opposite to south. They're opposite rather than independent.
All right. I guess maybe we could have some more insight into what the elements are.
Well, let's play around with them a little.
Good. All right.
They occur in other ways. For instance, Jung talks about the 4 functions: intellect, intuition, sensation, and feeling. Those are another version of the 4 elements. Intellect is air,
Right.
feeling is water, intuition is fire, and sensation is earth.
Right. And his personality structure sets up
Right.
somewhat of a similar axis.
Right. We all have these different functions, Jung calls them. He likes to use the word function rather than faculty, because faculty was used before in another context. Well, then we have 4 causes of Aristotle. They are a dead ringer for the 4 elements, but Aristotle didn't seem to recognize that they were similar, because he went ahead and invented the 4 causes when the 4 elements were already existing. So he couldn't have really understood the 4 elements.
Anything more you can tell us about what these elements symbolize?
Well, I'm tempted to go into sort of spontaneous things, because one of the most important differences of the ancient use of symbols from the mathematicians' use. To a mathematician, a symbol is an arbitrary term, like x equals the unknown, when you could have perfectly well used y. But the ancient use of symbols and the 4 elements as an example, you don't have to translate, and it's not arbitrary. I mean, we automatically fall into the habit of saying to earth something when we mean to be practical, and to fire something when we mean fire. In other words, we didn't have to be told about that. We did it, and that occurs spontaneously, say, in Pogo. You know this comic strip Pogo?
Yeah, love it.
It's one of my favorites. It is my favorite. The central group in Pogo is Pogo, Albert, Churchy, and Owl. Which would you guess was which?
Well, it's Owl obviously is the air, and Churchy's the
Owl
water.
is air because it's intellect, and Richard.
Churchy's the water.
Right. How did you know? Well, good.
So then we
Albert,
have
what's Albert?
Albert. Well, let's see. We have fire and earth left, don't we?
Yeah.
And I'd have to say Albert's earth.
Right.
So Pogo
The
himself
physical
is fire.
Pogo's fire. Now, why is Pogo fire?
That's a good question.
You notice the way the face is drawn and all those spikes
Indeed, he's
coming
got
out?
just like a little sun, isn't he?
Yeah,
Yes.
like a little sun.
Yeah.
But what animal is Pogo?
Well, he's a possum.
Possum. What do you know about a possum?
They're really tough, and they're really good fighters.
Well, what do they do? What is their...
Well, that's something I know from personal experience. They tend to sleep a lot, tend to play possum.
Play possum, what does that mean?
That means that they're actually more alert than they appear to be.
Well, the phrase play possum is pretend to be dead.
All right.
This is their way of...
Right.
Of...
It's a pretend.
pretend
Whichever
to be dead.
it's a pretense. Okay.
Now, why would... You see, we related fire to spirit and pogo to fire, so pogo stands for spirit.
Yes,
Why would man's spirit be represented by a possum?
That's wonderful.
You see the
That's
point?
wonderful.
Well, say it, because I want to be...
Okay, well, obviously this fiery spirit is playing possum. And it's
modern man is
it's not
playing
being,
possum.
it's
Right.
all it can be by any
Beautiful,
means.
beautiful.
All right.
Well,
That's
how
wonderful.
did he figure that out? He didn't learn esoteric literature.
Didn't he?
Just spontaneously used the possum, which pretends to be dead, to represent modern
That's just
man's
wonderful.
spirit.
Yeah.
Well, why did he take the turtle to represent emotion?
Well, the turtle's a water sign.
Right.
Mythologically carries man on its back. It's a savior.
Yeah, but a turtle has all this armoring.
A turtle has a lot of armoring. That's true.
He's proud of this
Is captured.
non-emotional state.
It's another dichotomous.
He's hiding in this armor.
Wonderful.
That was the base of Reichian therapy, to
Yeah.
get rid of this muscular armoring, which people have put around to protect their emotional state.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, it's so beautiful, and it shows how these things are still alive and well.
Yeah. You know, I'm wondering if I've ever seen owl fly.
But it doesn't matter in pogo whether he flies or not. The important thing about Owl is that he has this dunce cap. Well, it's not that he's a dunce. It's because the cap is pointing down. And that's a very profound symbol, I have to say, or indication of what thought really is. It's focus, pointing. And it's the opposite of the opposite side, which is fire. Fire goes out, explodes. Air focuses in. Well, we left out Albert, and all I can say about Albert, he's just as physical as you. You know, he always had his cigar.
There it is.
But I just remember the wonderful one where Dr. Frog arrives on the scene with his very precious amoeba in a test tube. And, of course, he's... Albert swallows the amoeba, and this is a great loss, so they have to recover the amoeba. And Owl goes down into Albert's stomach to get the lost amoeba. It's like the dragon thing, you see. But it's also like psychoanalysis, because Owl and Churchy, that's mind and emotion, get to fighting, arguing, and they're punching each other through Albert's stomach. This is just what goes on in psychoanalysis.
That's just wonderful.
Well, I don't see how I could get a better example of
I don't
that.
either. I don't need one. Have those same four principles been represented in other ways?
I use a lot of examples in the geometry of meaning, for instance, but this is mainly to bring home the importance of the elements. For example, suppose you are lost, and I give you a map. Now, the map is the formal cause. It states the relationship of things. But what else do you need if you're lost beside the map? If you don't know where you are on the map, it isn't any use to you. And you also have to know the scale of the map, because if I gave you a map of the world and you wanted to find your way to university or something, it wouldn't be any help. But the most important thing of all is the compass reading. You have to orient the map correctly. Otherwise you can't find, even if you know where you are and what the scale is, you won't know which direction to go unless you have the compass reading. And the compass reading is not that pointer thing on the map. That only tells you how to line it up with the real compass. Now this is a very powerful lesson and a teaching today and an answer to science. Science gives you the map, but it doesn't tell you which direction is north. Which direction is north is essentially a moral question, a fire question.
I see.
And always the North Pole in symbolism has represented the unchanging, the throne of God,
See, that's nice.
by which you orient yourself. Oh, I have other illustrations. The one that I like the best because it cuts right into the current science and critiques it is the four derivatives, or at least, strictly speaking, the position and its three derivatives. If you think of position, velocity, acceleration, and control, now think, how do we know position? We see it with our eyes. It's a sensation. How do we know velocity? I don't know whether you're onto this, but you really can't sense velocity.
Change in velocity.
No, I'm talking about velocity itself. We might be in an airliner going 600 miles an hour. We're talking to each other.
Yeah.
We have no way of knowing what speed we're
Right,
going.
I'm just saying you can only sense change in velocity.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't gotten to that yet.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm talking about how do we know velocity.
Yeah.
We'd have to look out the window and say, well, let's see, now it's 1 o'clock, that's Chicago, and then you look down an hour later, and that's New York. Oh, it's 600 miles in 1 hour, 600 miles an hour. We have to compute it.
Yeah.
So we know velocity through computation, through intellect. Now, acceleration, the scientists would say that's the second derivative. We can also compute that, but it gets more elaborate as a computation. Meanwhile, we can directly feel acceleration. When we go around the corner too fast, we're thrown to one side of the car, or if the elevator stops too suddenly, we feel it, or it starts too suddenly. This is a very basic thing. It's even more basic than sensation. So, okay, now we've got sensation, intellect, feeling. What about control? It doesn't fit quite as well, but it's quite closely related to your internal choices, your intuition and decisions, the control or will. It's through it's through control that you exercise your internal choices, your intuitions, your will. So it's the completely self-determined one, the control. Now, this doesn't mean you can't have a thermostat in which you link the control function back to one of the others so that when the temperature changes, the control turns on. But I'm talking about the open option of control. So the fact that you can readjust the thermostat. That's the important part of control.
Okay.
So we've got the four functions overlaid on the four derivatives.
All right.
And it shows that these things that are sacred to science, the derivatives, and this was the basis for the whole of Newtonian physics, are based on the different functions. So that the functions are more fundamental than human use of them. This is another way of showing that humanity or consciousness is not an epiphenomenon. It's built into the structure of the universe. It's not an epiphenomenon. It was there in the first place.
All right. What's the source of your knowledge regarding this fourfold?
Well, I got the idea from the astrology. In fact, if you don't mind, I'd rather jump to a much more finer division. You see, when you apply a fivefold and a sixfold on top of the fourfold, and the threefold, which is, I already mentioned in connection with the
Yes.
flow of time, you get 360-fold.
Oh, I see.
Because
I'll take
6
your word
times
for it.
5 times 4, well, 6 times 5
Yeah.
is 30, times 4 is 120, times 3 is 360.
Okay.
So you get the 360, or the sexagesimal system used by the Babylonians way that 2000 BC. Okay, well, when I first bumped into astrology, I heard about each degree of the zodiac having a different meaning. And this was totally unacceptable to me. I mean, the circle of the heavens was a continuum. There's no division. And I asked Mark Edmund Jones, his book is right here, called Philosophy, how come? How could space be divided into sections? And whether he didn't know or whether he knew he shouldn't answer, he said nothing. So I had to figure it out for myself.
I see.
And that was the greatest thing that ever happened to me, that I had to figure that out for myself. And the answer is very interesting. Maybe I ought to leave it to you to figure out for yourself. But we can't. Anyhow, when you divide something, like make a division between two parties, you're creating an opposition.
Yes.
You've got the meaning of opposition by division by two. Well, to get the meaning of movement or flow or change, you have to divide by 3, as I mentioned before. So dividing by 4, you get this analytical tool. Dividing by 5, you get something else. In other words, it's by these successive divisions that you get meaning. And if you apply all the possible rational divisions, 6, 5, 4, 3, you get 360.
Okay.
And that is very fundamental in astrology.
Thank you. All right, Arthur, I think that'll do it for today.
Yeah, okay.
And I especially appreciate your expansion of my appreciation for our favorite comic strip.
Pogo, right?